Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the James Beard Foundation Media Awards at home. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes to get started. I'm Jamila Robinson, the chair of the James Beard Foundation Journalism Committee. I'm going to be joined today by John T. Edge, one of our media award winners, and then Chef Tunde Wey for a conversation. So if folks can stand by, you will be muted during the conversation, but we will open it up for questions, and you can drop your questions in the chat as we are getting folks ready. We're going to give folks about 2 minutes to join in, but thanks for joining us. And I'm watching folks join in here.
I'm watching the number mount.
Great. We'll give it about 1 more minute. Again, if you'll be muted for those of you who are just joining. You're going to be muted during the conversation, and if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat, and we'll circle back to them later on in the conversation. I think we might have a quorum. Wonderful. Good afternoon. I am Jamila Robinson, the food editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer and the chair of the James Beard Foundation Journalism Committee. And today's conversation is, what is food writing's role in a divided nation? You're watching the James Beard Awards at home. I'm so excited for all of you who are joining in. I'm thrilled to be joined by John T. Edge, the winner of our M.K. Fisher Distinguished Writing Award for his story, My Mother's Catfish Stew, and Tunde Wey, the writer, chef, activist. We're so excited to have this conversation and to be discussing what is food writing's role in a divided nation. Again, I'm Jamila Robinson, the chair of the Journalism Committee. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So we'll go ahead and jump into this conversation. One of the things that we've been talking about is what is the role of food writing in a divided nation. A lot has happened in the past week as we have seen food media go through this reckoning. Our chair, Claire Eichenbach, released a statement yesterday about what the James Beard Foundation is going to be doing across food media. So I would love to kind of kick things off with the two of you to discuss what is that. What's your reflection on some of the things that have happened this week in food writing, this reckoning on the lack of inclusion and diversity, the maleness of food criticism? What's you all's take on those things?
Jamila, do you want to maybe expand on what has happened? Because I'm not sure if we all know what has happened.
Sure. So we've seen not all across the food media. I can talk about our own, my own organization, the Philadelphia Inquirer, with having issues with racial, with headlines that are, with our headline "Buildings Matter Too." We had an editor resign. Our staff has talked about, our Black and people of color have talked about being sick and tired, and want to pull people, are tired of pulling people into, the 21st century on racial justice, is how they phrased it. We saw Rappaport of Bon Appetit resign after accusations of brown face. He said that that's not what it is, but was dressed up in, as he and his wife as Puerto Ricans in these offensive displays. We've seen an editor have to resign at the New York Times. We've seen conflicts at the Wall Street Journal and across food media. And so there's this reckoning that's happening. And so I would love to hear your reflections on because it's not only happening in food media, but it's happening across the nation. And so I wanted to hear your reflections on some of those things.
Thank you, Jamila. John T, you want to go? Or?
Go ahead, Tunde.
I think, well, I am still processing everything that is happening. So I don't know if I have a coherent response. I do know that, I'm generally not impressed, I'm not impressed with figureheads losing their jobs. Actually, I'm sort of like writing or thinking about this moment and thinking of it through the filter of my experience as a Nigerian, growing up in Nigeria. And just a brief history, Nigeria got its independence from the British in 1960. And it was a parliamentary country, so there was a prime minister, and it was civilian rule. 6 years later, there was a coup. So from 1966 up until 1991, except for two short times, it was entirely a military government. So I grew up most of my life in Nigeria under that sort of rule. The interesting thing about that is that in 1966, there was this class, they call them now the class of 66. These officers who were tangentially or integral to that coup. From that time up until now, every single president but one has been connected to that class of 66. So when I think about that, and I think about food media, and I think about maybe specifically the fellow from Bon Appetit who left his job, that's a single person, right, connected to a class of people, and that class of people still remain in positions of power, right? Bon Appetit is owned by Condé Nast. Condé Nast is owned by another company that I keep forgetting the name. Yes. Losing one employee or figurehead doesn't change anything. I have an entire country as proof of that. So
I'm sorry, Tunde, to interrupt you, but I think we're having some issues with the sound.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you great, Tunde. Jamila, okay. Jamila, you're cracking up on my end. I don't know.
Okay.
So anyway, I was saying that we have an entire country as proof. Nigeria, we actually have an entire country, the United States, as proof that regimes rise and fall, administrations come and go, EICs resign and new ones are hired, but shit is the same for the most part. Those are my reflections.
How about you, John T? How has seeing some of the reckoning that has happened across food media, what's your reaction to some of the news over the last week?
Tunde and I didn't coordinate it this way, but I'm thinking about historical moments too. I was born in Georgia and have now lived in Mississippi for 25 years. And, I think as I began to study the South and write about the South, I focused on Dr. King's idea of a long arc that bends towards justice. And, but I also think in light of, what we've realized about, food media, what we've realized about, you know, our cultural or deeply seated cultural problems and challenges today, is that perhaps I and others have been too celebratory of our ideas about the civil rights movement and where that got us, our ideas about various movements toward justice and where that got us. I read a book a year or so ago, and I just went back to it in the last week, and it's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History. And it's about a woman named Janet Theo Harris, and it's about the uses and misuses of the civil rights movement, and the stories about the civil rights movement, and stories about the American quest toward equity, or, you know, and it is, you know, that's helped me think, because even though I see progress, it's hard not to see regress, and it's hard now to chart a path forward. And I'll stop there, but I do think that, like with so many things we reckon with America, historical grounding helps. It may not get us somewhere, but it at least helps us get situated in the moment and realize where we are.
Thanks for that, John T. For those of you who are just joining, you're watching the James Beard Media Awards at home. I'm Jamila Robinson. I'm here with John T. Edge and Tunde Wey. So I wanted, you mentioned power. And you and Tunde, John T, and you and Tunde wrote back in 2016 for Oxford American essays about power in food media and what those structures look like. What are your thoughts on, when you wrote that essay back in 2016, you're talking about who gets a seat at the table and the reflections of how to give up power. How do you see that now?
I see it as a warning Tunde offered in 2016 that not enough was done, and that's why we're in 2020. I see it in other ways too, and I don't mean to be flip, but I reread that in preparation for this conversation, and I thought about, you know, the generous way in which Tunde said, you know, what's going to happen if power isn't seated? What's going to happen if a reckoning doesn't come? And you know, he seems pretty prescient.
Right, I'm definitely not a prophet, so I don't think folks need to try hard to see that what I said in 2016 was real. Like, I wasn't predicting anything. I was just stating a fact. And I remember actually the process for me for writing that was John T had asked me to share the column, and I personally didn't know anything about what the fuck was happening. You know, there was some sort of like spat between some folks in the South about food. It was Michael Tweedy and I think Sean Brock. There was something that happened that I actually didn't know anything about, and then it sort of like expanded to
Paula
to
Dean.
international, right? And so, and this is a true story. I didn't do any research about what was happening. I just wrote something because I knew that what I was writing was applicable. Like, I didn't have to even like figure out who did what to who. I just knew who the protagonists were and who the antagonists were and what the resolution should be. And we're here again, and we will be here unfortunately again and again, and the antagonists remain the same, the protagonists too, but the resolution is still unmet, is unresolved, and it remains so in, you know, in the piece at the end when I asked John T, what are you willing to give up? And John T sort of like expresses in wonderful prose, his wonderful prose that I am jealous of, expresses all that and ends with nothing. You know, that is, you know, that's sort of where we are. You know, that's sort of where we are, taking a long, winding road to get back to the beginning of this whole thing. And, you know, that's where we are.
So I would love to hear from both of you, in your reflections on power, what are you willing to get up? So what does a radical change look like? What does storytelling, what does food writing look like with a radical change in the image and the ideals that that you both see?
I mean, one of the things I'd like to, I mean, this is a matter of semantics, but so many matters we're taking on now are matters of semantics that when I think about what Tunde does and what I attempt, it's not food writing really. It's, as Tunde would tell you, and I think I would say, I mean, Tunde's writing about economics, he's writing about equity, he's writing, and I attempt to engage the same ideas. And I think, we're all writing about the American condition. We're writing towards some better future. We're writing to critique. We're writing to enlighten. And I think in a way, labeling it as food writing, it's culture writing. And I don't mean to be even, I mean, maybe that sounds insecure even, because I do write about food, but I think we're all pushing towards something else. And Tunde, I think Tunde, Tunde can speak for himself. I'll quit speaking about Tunde. But I think it's important to say that we're trying to grapple with those things that trouble us, and we may take different paths and expect different outcomes. But is it food writing? I don't know. Do you think you do
Food
food
writer,
writing
Tunde?
too?
Well,
Is that what you do?
Well, let me answer that question and also answer the question that you asked, which is what does radical food writing mean? Which I think that the writing that I do and what food writing should be, and I'm not the best example of it. I think of some other people in my life, but I think when you connect these two questions is, to be crass, there has to be some sort of suicide, some sort of death, like on the page or on the screen. And by that I mean that if we're talking about radical food writing and from whatever position that we're in, I think of the position that I'm in as I have power. I'm, sort of like the biggest sort of power and privilege that I struggle with is being a man and what that means, and sort of like taking up space in that way. And the truth about that sort of power, or any sort of power, is whiteness or maleness or being resource rich, is that, I don't know, this is probably a biblical term, that you have to die unto yourself, like you have to make work that compromises yourself. And like, but fundamentally compromises yourself. And this is the only way that we can see a radical shift in power, but also like a radical shift on the page. It is not. There is no other way to achieve the sort of parity or the equity that we're looking for by doing the same thing. There's no other way. Like, you can't write on the page and say, I believe in equity, or put up a post, I believe. It's just not possible. That doesn't mean anything. And this is why I don't feel optimistic about a change, is because I know the sort of courage that it takes to in a sense, kill who you are is too much. I mean, it's often too much for me. It's definitely too much for white people, as we can see. And so the kind of writing that I aspire to, whether I'm writing about food or writing about whatever, is to make sacrifices that are evident on the page and be vulnerable in such a way that I free myself of the burden that I'm carrying, but I'm also open to all sorts of, I don't know, feedback and shit. But I'm also taking up less space. And this is what needs to happen. Like, we need certain things to die. I wrote this essay in 2018 about Bourdain, and at the time that I wrote it, he was alive, and then he died. I'm not quite sure when after, maybe a couple of months or so. And I just kept thinking about the essay, because I remember when I wrote it, like, the opinion on the essay was split. I was criticizing Bourdain, But in it, I said that Bourdain needs to die a figurative death, and then he died a literal one, and I was really affected by that, by my words, and then by the reality of his life. But in this moment, I think that like that is so true, that we need many folks with power to die figurative deaths. And what that means is that that power is ceded, that space that they occupy is taken up by other folks.
May I speak to Tunde's?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jamila.
No, please go on, John T.
No, I wanted to speak to Tunde's eloquence about this notion of being vulnerable, and you know, I think if you want to reach people with the ferocity of and elegance of your ideas, then you have to give something of yourself. To Tunde's point, you know, this big picture point that you want to make about society or belief or anything else has to be grounded in some personal revelation. And I think that's what makes for good writing of the sort that I attempt. I've never been a daily newspaper journalist. I've always written essays, and that word comes from the French, to try, like to try to reach somebody. And it's only recently though that this piece I actually wrote that earned me this award this year for the Beard Foundation about my mother, is the very first time I think I've written about, I've written to emotion and written to vulnerability and busted myself open in a way I didn't expect, instead of writing to ideas. And and I appreciate what Tunde said, because I've realized it, and I'm 57 years old. I wrote that when I was 55, 56, and it took me that long to get there. And I think that's what's going to make me better as a writer, whether I'm taking on my family, which is what that essay was about, or whether I'm taking on racial inequity and my role in it.
So, I mean, that kind of leads, I think, to another question about not only about vulnerability, but as we're writing about racial justice, and as can we turn, as news media, can we turn inward, and as writers, as journalists, as people who are in the media more broadly, can we turn inward and take a look at the systems that we uphold, and can we write about them in a way that will dismantle, to Tunde's point, that will, figuratively kill the things that, kill the systems that we uphold. Is there a way that you think writers can turn inward and look at this moment of racial justice at a time that we're thinking more about racial justice, to write inward, to turn inwardly and write with that kind of vulnerability?
I just talked a lot, Tunde. You talk.
Sure. I like to sometimes simplify things to myself, and one of the simplicities that I use is distinguishing between material problems and less tangible problems. I think issues of power manifest in both realms. So the question, what writers can do to be vulnerable and turn inward to impact this moment, to me, that's immaterial, not in the sense of not having meaning and importance, but in the sense of not being materially relevant to our physical well-being. That's an immaterial question or action. And I think we all need to do this immaterial work on our own. Right, materially, what needs to happen is that motherfuckers need to just get out of the way. Like, that's what needs to happen, And when you're out of the way in your space, you can then do this work. But we can't wait on folks to have a transformation internally before there's an external manifestation of that transformation. That's some sort of maybe some religious idea that we have been saddled with. You know, we can decouple the two. It's that folks can do work on themselves on their own, and at the same time relinquish the power that they hold, which isn't theirs, to tell stories about people who aren't them, and to sort of like gatekeep these spaces that were created by other folks, by Black folks, by brown folks, by women, by trans folks, by all sorts of folks. But yeah, it's the same folks who are still in power. So I am definitely interested in personal transformation. But I know from my own life that my shit is taking so long, and that if the world were to wait on me, we'll be here a long time, you know. But if me and other folks were to move out of the way, so if folks in power were to move out of the way, and I'm not talking about a symbolic leaving. I'm not talking about the fellow from Bon Appetit leaving. I'm talking about the fellow from Bon Appetit leaving, but all the structures that hold him up leaving as well. I'm talking about, to be very specific, I'm talking about the company that owns Condé Nast investing, say, $10 million in a startup that is owned by a Black man, a food startup by Steven Satterfield, Whetstone Media. Like, take money, take $10 million and invest it in this Black man's company. That's what I'm talking about. And when you do that too, then you can like do your own internal personal work. But there are material needs right now, and we need serious people to like address those needs. And we don't need folks who are on this like long journey of repentance that is public, and that still somehow magically is still sucking up and capturing resources.
John T.
Yeah, Tunde, would you argue that beyond I don't know, beyond the debt that perhaps Condé Nast or Advance, I think there's their parent company, perhaps owes, would you say that backing Whetstone is a good business decision too?
I don't know. I don't know what is a. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We have a myth about business and what is a good business decision and what is not. What is true is that businesses aren't often in the business of profits or maximization. They're in the business of power, and power looks like different things. Sometimes power looks like not making money right now so you can make money next time. Sometimes power looks like you know, employing a friend or a friend's child to your job who may not be as competent, but because you want to consolidate power, you do that. So I think the question of what is a good or bad business decision is irrelevant. The question of what is necessary, that's the one that we should be asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I think it's important for us to have that to add that to the dialogue when we think about, you know, how do you invest? How do you? I mean, when we go back to the central question of what is food media's role in racial justice, what kinds of investments need to happen, what kinds of structures need to be placed, what kind of employment pipeline, all of these things that we constantly talk about that are necessary in food media, but then we don't have a deeper dialogue about that investment in a Whetstone, in Clancy Miller's For the Culture,
Right.
these kinds of projects that folks are putting together on their own. The Museum of Food and Drink, for example, with the work that that Dr. Jessica was working on. So I think those are part of the dialogues of, you know, what is the role of food media in racial justice? Going back to your essays on power, that was something that I thought was key, was the amount of dialogue that you were having. What else is missing from the dialogue? We talked about investment, but and vulnerability, what other things are missing?
Speaking to the dialogue between me and Tunde, or the larger dialogue?
The larger dialogue.
I think right now, and I don't mean to make this a sweeping observation, but I think right now in conversations about equity, too often we're retreating to two different camps that disagree with each other and aren't finding a space in the middle to converse. And I think about this, there's a poet who named Patricia Spears Jones, who I respect and like, is from Arkansas and lives in New York now. And she said, in essence, and she may have been quoting someone else, but she said, in essence, between white liberals and activist Black people now, the distance between the two can be a killing field right now. And you know, I think that we are, and for good reason in this moment, riven. You know, I realize talk isn't the solution, but you know, I think about, you know, retreats Tunde and I've gone to and time we spent, you know, and I realize I'm opening myself up for criticism for just saying this, but I sure would like to return to the metaphorical and real table. Yeah.
Yeah. Fuck the table, you know, like for real,
No.
like yeah, fuck that, because
yeah,
yo, you look at the James Beard Foundation, how many Black folks are in positions of power, right? Look at the SFA, how many Black folks are in positions of power? But there's this like tremendous capacity for organizations like James Beard, SFA, for you, John T, for other folks in power to absorb criticism and swell with that criticism, but then like deflate the expectations of everybody else because nothing changes. You know, I wrote something in 2018 or 17 for the Beard Foundation when the Beard Foundation was again thinking about the question of race and shit, and I said that all the white folks who are nominated should recuse themselves. You know, that if we get to a place where white folks or folks with power and affluence feel the same sort of like tight desperation that other folks feel, then maybe they will begin to think differently. You know, the quote from Martin Luther King, where he talks about the arc of justice bends towards, so the arc of time bends towards justice.
Freedom bends towards
justice.
The arc of freedom bends towards justice. Is long, but bends towards justice.
Right. He never said it touches justice, right? But that's the assumption that people have, like, we're going to get there. How? How are we going to get there if nothing changes, right? If nobody gives something up that is fundamentally important to them. Like the relationship between our work and justice is that of these two lines that never touch. It is, they come closer and closer and closer, but they never touch. Asymptotes are what they're called. So that is the relationship that we have. And I believe his name is Derek Bell, and he has a book called Faces at the Black Bottom of the Well, or something similar to that, where he talks about not being encouraged that anything is going to change, but because he doesn't take change for granted, he's willing to work very hard. The problem is folks like the SFA, like the James Beard Foundation, have somehow invested in this idea that change is inevitable, that we are moving in a linear trajectory towards change, so they can do the least bits possible. But if you think that change is not coming and change is impossible, then you are going to do the most that you can to get it as close to the impossible as we can get. And this is what we need. We need folks to do more and to assume that this sort of like paradise post-racial society that that folks talk about or dream about is not coming. But what can come now is, again, folks take up less space. You know, everybody quit your job. I mean, just, you're taking up too much space. You're taking up too much money. You know, that is as simple as that. So when I say fuck the table, we can bring the table back after Black folks, brown folks, women, and all the marginalized folks are in positions of power. We can bring the table back and have a conversation about what to do then. Because the truth about reparations and resource transfer is that that is not even the beginning. That is not even the beginning of of the step that we need to take to get to the place that we are going. That is a prerequisite for the beginning. And so to have all of this hand wringing around just to begin the conversation, to have all this consternation about where to go when we haven't even done the fundamental, the baseline thing is fucked up.
So Tunde, you think that white people, the James Beard Foundation, white voters should recuse themselves, turn the table over. John T, so those could be some radical changes. And sometimes we don't think about a radical change as being possible or it's being too far. John T, what are some radical changes that you think that the Beard Foundation or SFA or any organization that has been entrenched across food media, how would you turn the table over?
It's a great question. I mean, I realize my answer is going to be, in essence, gradualism, because I recognize the changes that need to come, but they're going to be too gradual for this. But I'm still going to spell them out because I see the right steps taken. It's not just writing about Black subjects, it's Black writers writing about Black subjects. And the next step is Black writers writing reported pieces, not pieces that are merely personal and explaining themselves. And the next stop is Black writers writing about anything they care to write about. And then the next stop is the editors are Black, and the power that controls the media is Black, and people of color and women. Those are steps along the way. They're not turning the table over, but they're fixing the busted wagon that we've got right now.
So I think we've got a few minutes left, so I would love to turn it over to our attendees to ask questions. Folks, you can drop them. Oh, sure, go right ahead.
I just wanted to say something that when I say that white folks should recuse themselves, I think there's a natural inclination to think, that, well, if there are no white folks, then, then the competition is compromised or whatever is compromised, which is ridiculous. There's so much competition already among other folks who aren't white that, if anything, we're talking about probably elevating the level of competition, elevating the level of mastery, of honesty. So I want people to disabuse themselves of the idea that an absence of white folks means an absence of excellence. That is not true at all.
And since Tunde's adding a qualification, I wanted to see if I could add one too, please. When I asked that question about Whetstone, is that a good business decision? I didn't mean that in the fiscal balance sheet sense. I meant it in exactly the way that Tunde replied to it, that I think an investment in Whetstone, if you're a smart company, is a good business decision for all those reasons you enumerated. And it's a magazine I admire, and I just don't want in this moment for that to be misconstrued. So, thanks.
Right. Thanks to both of you for those clarifications. In a few minutes, so that we've had a couple of questions come in, and for other folks who are watching, again, thank you for being here. You can drop your questions in the chat. We have one for Tunde. Tunde said he wasn't impressed with the reactions to date. If you were to be impressed, what would have to happen? I think you may have answered some of that, but
a wholesale clear out, significant investment in, if we're talking specifically about food media, I would say, and this may not be a popular opinion, and I'm still sort of wrestling with what this means. I don't think Bon Appetit is separate from the EIC who left, right? There's a whole senior management or editorial team. Those people should leave too. There's so many fucking talented folks of color who are on that team, who are outside of that team, who can tell infinitely better stories. like for real. Like there's a, and this is an intellectual point, but there's a threat, and it's not even a threat, it's real, that places like Bon Appetit, the SFA, the James Beard Foundation are irrelevant because they aren't holding anything but space for themselves, you know? And so I'm saying, even from an aesthetic perspective, the sort of stories that we want to see, the sort of emotions that we want to contend with, those stories aren't being told by the folks in power right now, by the folks who have the resources. They're folks, these are stories that are held in other communities. And so to be specific, you know, invest in media companies like Whetstone, like For the Culture, and then hire competent, brilliant Black and brown folks, not just in one position, but in all the positions.
I'd like to speak to that too. And you know, what Tunde is saying is about this bench of talent that's out there, and is not being called upon now by mainstream, I won't use that term, by white control media now. And you know, I can speak to that very directly because the newest issue of our journal, Gravy, which is the deputy editor of which is Cynthia Greenlee, a Black woman. For the next issue, she kindly asked me to step away from the issue in a kind of similar question that Tunde asked me, and the issue is majority Black and brown. I don't mention that to ask for congratulations for doing that. I mention that because the issue is the best we'll ever publish, because there is a roster of writers out there who had never appeared in our pages, and now will.
It doesn't have to be the best you ever publish. You could step away permanently.
I know. I hear you. I know.
I mean, if you're saying that the best that can happen is when Black folks are in charge, then you also say that your leave is temporary. Then there's a gulf there that can be examined. Do we want the best, or do we want, you know, the same old thing?
And that also creates an opportunity, don't you think? Because yes, if that's going to be the best issue that you've ever had, then by all means, those folks should be, you know, should be nominated for Beard Awards, so that we're adding more to the pool, that we are adding more to the bench. I mean, you're talking about like a clearing out of people, sort of, idealistically, but then also there's the idea, there's the possibility of also changing the awards by having more people who are entered. Like we are going to broaden the pool.
Right.
Yeah, just more questions here from the audience. How do we get more representation when the gatekeepers are clearly favoring specific cuisines? This is a great question. And the owners and chefs who perpetuate white cuisines, and those who appropriate other cuisines and not those reaching out to engage with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And helping to learn, and it's also asking, can all those folks spend time to learn more about the roots of that cuisine? How do we get the gatekeepers to add that
that's a lot of
representation?
I think, not to sound like a broken record, my answer is the same, and my answer is the same, so much so that I remember why I initially didn't want to do this is because you know, folks have been saying this stuff over and over and over again. I just started saying this stuff, say, in 2016. Why are we here? Why are we having these conversations? Like, why is that person asking that question? We know the answer. The gatekeepers should leave. It's as simple as that. Like, this doesn't require rocket science. If the gatekeeper needs to do more research, they can do that on their own. You know, like it's pretty simple, and it's also pretty frustrating at the same time. You know, But I guess that's where we are. People should be asking, how can we get people to leave? That's the question that should be coming up in here. Not how can we make administrative tweaks to this current system so that we can see more black and brown faces. Like, no, how can we get people to leave? The next 20 questions should be about that.
I'm curious about that term gatekeeper, because it seems like it obscures something else. Because, you know, an editor decides yes and no to pieces. Or by using the term gatekeeper, are we talking about something wherein, you know, it's a practice of racism to keep certain people out? Because the term gatekeeper either seems too soft, or it doesn't work for me. I don't know. I mean, I understand it, but are we hiding behind something? What are we trying to say when we say gatekeeper?
That's a good question. Another question, another question from folks in the room. How can we integrate food justice writing into the conversation of expanding Black writing and critical race thought into general food writing?
It's already happening. People are already doing this work. People are already writing this way. Nicole Taylor is writing in this way. Omar Tate is writing in this way. So many folks it's already happening. So again, if you want to create more space for this kind of writing, because the system that we occupy is zero sum, then some folks have to leave. That's how it's going to happen.
And on my side of this conversation, I think it's incumbent upon people who look like me to write that way and write to those subjects. Because if you know, if whiteness got here and ideas about whiteness and the making of the idea about whiteness got us here, then it's incumbent upon white people to write to this too.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not getting my point across, Chanti. I feel like, yes, I think white people should write about this, but white people should write about this in private. They shouldn't write about this and get paid. White people should take up less space. That's the answer.
Yeah, and that's where, you know, that piece we co-wrote back a few years back, that was, you know, the defining difference in our stances was that, you know, I find the greatest hope in my region, the American South, is because it was born of a biracial culture, and it was by force a Black culture, and Black contribution was there by way of force, but the culture, as I see it, is biracial, and I see that in that hope, and I see that means I should not go quiet wholly.
You should go quiet. The culture is one of racial dominance and racial warfare. That's the culture. Biracial is a whitewashing of what that is. This is racial war and violence perpetrated on Black folks. That's the culture, and that's why you should go silent. That's why white folks should go silent. And there's a fear in that silence. I understand, I know, but you know, there's peace there too. So you know, find the peace there. But this idea that that again, this is like post-racial idea of unity is doesn't exist.
I'm not claiming unity, but I am claiming that the thing that I call the South was made by Black and white. Black and white were not equal by any stretch, and Black people were there by under duress and threat. But the thing that we call the South was made by both with unequal contributions. And yeah.
Well, I want to give each of you a final word. We have a couple more questions coming in with things that are more broadly about food media. Some folks are asking about local media, shakeups in local media. I mean, I think we have some of the same issues in local media. The question was for me to speak to what's happening in Philadelphia, and that is something that I see of not having enough voices and being able to be in positions of power and having people of color in positions of power to make those changes, changing things like freelance rates and not only how we tell stories, who tells those stories, and then who gets to be in the room. We've had a lot. We see this a lot across food media and the local media markets, where and I can speak for my own organization, where my entire freelance pool when I came in was almost entirely white and mostly male. And that has been a process of dismantling that. It was something that had been entrenched, and we can see that across every news media market. So for the folks in the room who are asking, what can you do if you don't have a huge budget, or you can't walk away from your positions? You can do something as simple as looking at your freelance pool and hiring all new Black and Brown Indigenous writers. Those are some of the easy wins that you can make. And for other folks who are looking for other ideas on that, you can go to jamesbeer.org and find some. We'll be talking more about best practices on how to be more inclusive. We have a lot of data and information on that. And so we are over time. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us for the James Beard Award at home. This has been a really provocative conversation about the systems of power. How do we bring racial justice to our food writing? We are going to have to continue this conversation because we are not going to solve this today, but we know that there are action steps that you all can take, and Tunde Wey and John T. Edge will be continuing to write about these subjects. Final words from the two of you.
When are you going to resign, John T? That's my final word.
Say again.
I'm actually raising money now so that the position I now hold, the next person who assumes that position won't have to raise their own money. So, it's not the answer you want, Tunde, but it is an answer that I've been in my position 20 years. It's time for me to get out of the way. I recognize that and embrace that. Every time I talk to you, I find your arguments both challenging and seductive. Every time.
Challenging, seductive. Well, we will continue to challenge and have these challenging conversations. For those of you who are watching, who may have found this to be an uncomfortable conversation, stay with that. These conversations are
it's uncomfortable for me too to tell John T to quit his job. It's not like I enjoy this, but if folks of color are willing to do this work, white folks too,
Yeah, I think that's a really important. I think that's really important to say. I mean, sometimes, for those of us, who are Black or POC, we are often asked to do a lot of heavy lifting. We do a lot of invisible work, and this is an opportunity for other people to stand in that uncomfortable space and think about racial justice in your workplaces, across food media, some of the structstructures that you may participate in. I mean, racism is an art form that touches everything. My mother used to say, it is a product that sells itself. So how can you continue to dismantle that across food media, across the James Beard Awards, the Southern Food Alliances, all of our organizations? It's incumbent upon us to do that heavy lifting. Stay in that uncomfortable space. It's actually normal. I want to thank all of you, everyone who joined us. Thank you to John T. Edge and to Tunde Wey, to the James Beard Foundation, and all of the work that we're doing to bring the media awards to you virtually. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. You can look for our next virtual event around July 1st. Visit jamesbeard.org for the rest of the program. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.